Today is January the 3rd, 2010. Mark wanted to do a study tonight on...
Okay, we're going to be talking about churches. The Church of the Protestant Reformed Faith.
Okay, and probably a little bit more... expand on that just a little bit, the Protestant Reformation, the history of the Protestant Reformation. And if we were to put a date on that, it would be between 1517 and 1648. The word Protestant, another word of saying is Protestant. Protestant. Protesting the doctrine of Roman Catholicism. That's really what brought about the Protestant Reformation, protesting the doctrines of Roman Catholicism. Totally antithetical to the teachings of Rome. And a lot of times they'll date that back in 1517 when Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. Now, there was a lot of European religious wars, 131 years, that finally ended up in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Now, really, before we even get into the Protestant churches and the Reformation, we need to talk about some of the precursors to it. We've talked before about the Waldenses, John Wycliffe and John Huss, and those who really helped usher in the Reformation. But we know that humanism and Catholicism had taken both roots in the 16th century. And we know that Luther was a Catholic priest, and we know that he posted his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg. And that was a good example of Protestant. Martin Luther became a Protestant to Rome and his teachings. And it began really more as an attempt to reform the Catholic Church. There were certain Catholics who were opposing what they perceived as false doctrines and what I guess you could call ecclesiastic malpractice. Now, especially the teaching and the sale of indulgences. And simony. Simony, of course, is the selling and buying of clerical offices. And, of course, the Reformers saw this as an evidence of the systematic corruption of the church hierarchy, which, of course, led right up to the Pope himself. Before Martin Luther, John Wycliffe and John Huss, who had attempted to reform the Catholic Church, were, of course, persecuted for their faith. Now, the 95 thesis that Martin Luther nailed on the door of Wittenberg in Saxony was against indulgences of Roman Catholic Church. And the theses debated and criticized the Church, it criticized the Pope, but it was really focused upon the selling of indulgences and the doctrinal practices against purgatory and Mariolatry, and the intercession of the devotion to the saints. And of course it also came against most of the sacraments, the mandatory clerical celibacy, refusing the priest to marry, forbidding them to marry, and also against monasticism. You know, that the Roman Catholic Church had just come into monasticism, where the people were put in monasteries and they were basically enslaved to the Roman Catholic Church. And then, shortly after this, Zwingli came upon the scene, who followed Martin Luther's example. Even though a lot of these reformers disagreed among themselves and divided on their doctrinal differences. First, of course, between Luther and Zwingli, and later between Luther and John Calvin. And this established different and rival Protestant churches, their denominations, such as the Lutherans, the Reformed, Calvinists, and the Presbyterian. And then, of course, we know that out of England and the English Reformation came Anglicanism. Most Protestant denominations were derived from the Germanic denominations. Now, the Protestant Reformation was accelerated because there were so many different fronts that was coming against the counter Reformation of the Catholic Church. Now, all mainstream Protestants generally date their doctrinal separation from the Roman Catholic Church to the 16th century. And so that is just a brief history of that. Now, we can go into a little bit more of what kind of, to give you just a broad sweep, like we said, really the Anabaptists predate the Protestants. The Anabaptists, again, are those who never went into Rome in the first place. Groups like the Valdenses, the Paulicians, the Arnoldists were never joined to Rome, and they were adamantly opposed to infant baptism, and they were adamantly opposed to all the doctrines of Rome. And then Reformed churches, Calvinism, Presbyterianism, Congregationalism, Lutherans, Puritans, Separatists, all of that came along later, and Anglicanism. And then, so when we talk about the Baptists were really, the Anabaptists were the precursors to the Baptists. And then later came Pietism and the Methodists. The Methodists really didn't come along till, around 1720. So they're kind of late on the scene. And then, of course, the Adventists came along even later, and the Holiness movement came along even later, and the Pentecostalism came along even later than that. John Wycliffe at Oxford University was one of the first disruptive scholars to point out the absolute heresies of the Roman Catholic Church. And we've already talked about John Huss, who was executed by burning in spite of the fact that he was promised safe conduct by Rome. They lied to him. And anyway, there was a radical protesting of what had gone on in the Roman Catholic Church, which brought about these new doctrinal, and they weren't new at all, but they were coming against, and many of the people that were Protestants had been Roman Catholic priests, like Martin Luther. John Calvin was a Roman Catholic priest. Now, the Renaissance period stimulated unprecedented academic activity. The big concern was for academic freedom. Everything was about freedom. And Martin Luther was shocked by the corruption of the clergy when he had on his trip to Rome in 1510. There was even license on whorehouse and brothels, and there were special taxes on priests who kept mistresses. And this same priest who imposed these taxes was named Sixtus IV, Pope Sixtus IV. He also was the one that established the selling of indulgences to be applied to the dead. So this gave them a virtually endless source of revenue, the Catholic Church, by imposing taxes on the dead. Pope Alexander, who was Pope Alexander the Sixth, from 1492 to 1503, was one of the most controversial of the Renaissance popes. He fathered 7 children, including Lucretia and Sessa Borgia, by at least 2 different mistresses. 14 years after his death, the corruption of the papacy that Alexander the Sixth exemplified, particularly the sale of indulgences, would prompt Martin Luther to nail the summary of his grievances on the door of church in Germany and launch the Protestant Reformation. Official brothels or whorehouses existed in many private towns, sometimes even owned by the city council. And the clergy made up about 20% of the people who went to these whorehouses and bathhouses. So the protest against Rome began in earnest with Martin Luther. He was a friar. He was of the order of St. Augustine, and he was a professor at the University of Wittenberg. And Luther's dissent marked a sudden outbreak of a new and irresistible force of discontent which had been pushed underground but not resolved. Now, at the same time in Germany, a movement began in Switzerland under the leadership of Zwingli. These two movements quickly agreed on most issues, as the recently from place to place. Much of, by the way, of the material that I'm using on this history is taken from Wikipedia. They have done a good, concise way of describing these events during the Protestant Reformation. So we'll give them the credit. Some of the followers of Zwingli believed that the Reformation was too conservative and moved independently toward more radical positions. other Protestant movements grew up along lines of mysticism or humanism. Of course, that was Erasmus, who followed Luther. John Calvin was very influential in establishing a consensus among various groups in Switzerland, Scotland, Hungary, Germany, and elsewhere. The foundations of Augustinism, both Luther and Calvin thought along lines linked with theological teachings of Augustine of Hippo. They were very much against Pelagianism, a heresy that they perceived in the Catholic Church of their day. In the course of all of this upheaval, many of Catholics were slaughtered at the hands of Protestant bands, and many Protestants were slaughtered at the hands of Catholic bands. But the most persecuted of all were those who never went into Rome in the first place, and that were those of the groups that I mentioned earlier, the Armalists, the Valdenses, the Paulicians. Now, there was also a political separation of the Church of England from Rome under Henry VIII, beginning in 1529 and completed in 1536, which brought England alongside the broad reform movement. However, religious changes in the English national church proceeded more conservatively than elsewhere in Europe. Frederick the Wise did not support Luther, who was a professor at the university. He found that he protected him by hiding Luther in Wartburg Castle. Frederick the Wise was a very devout Catholic, but only protected Luther in hopes of obtaining greater political autonomy from the Church. Zwingli and Calvin were supported by the city councils in Zurich and Geneva. This added to the prominence of Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli as leaders of the Reform movement. So, I'm not going to get into the aspect of the humanism led by Erasmus, but I am going to go on and go into a little bit of the Lutheranism, because it's directly related to the Protestant churches in our subject title. Now, Luther still clung to many tenets of the Catholic Church, including the Eucharist, which is called the real presence of the doctrine of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which affirms the real presence of holding bread and wine, and that they are, turned into literal bread and body, or eating the real bread and body. Anyway, we know that we, as Protestants today, believe that it is symbolic. It's not, we're not drinking Christ's literal blood when we drink wine or grape juice at communion. This was kind of what brought about the schism between him and Zwingli later on. So after Luther was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, we know he started the Lutheran Church, and then following that, the work and writings of John Calvin were influential in establishing a consensus among these various groups. Geneva, Switzerland became the capital, or unofficial capital, of the Protestant movement led by Calvin until his death. And then after that, William Farel, his ally, became the spiritual leadership of the group. At the same time, we see in Scandinavia, there was Reformation in Denmark. And that, of course, also ruled Norway and Iceland and Sweden and Finland, which converted to the faith of Protestantism. And in Sweden, the Reformation was spearheaded by Gustav Vasa, who was elected king in 1523. In England, the Anglican Church began to spring up under Henry VIII, and brought England alongside the broad Reformation movement. However, religious changes in England's national church proceeded more conservatively than elsewhere in Europe. The English Reformation followed a different course from the Reformation in continental Europe. There had long been a strong strain of anti-clericalism in England that had already given rise to the Lawler movement of John Wycliffe, which also played an important role in the Husterites in Bohemia, Hussites. And Henry VIII had been a sincere Catholic, and had even authored a book strongly criticizing Luther, but he later found it expedient and profitable to break with the papacy. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him only a single child, Mary. As England had recently gone through a lengthy dynastic conflict, Henry feared that his lack of a male heir might jeopardize his descendants' claim to the throne. So a lot of this had to do with the powers of civil authority as well. We see the sovereignty of God executed in bringing about the Protestant Reformation, not only with Luther and Calvin, but also within the civil authorities within governments. The Act of Supremacy made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England between 1535 and 1540. And then Thomas Cromwell came along. The policy known as the dissolution of monasteries was put into effect. And there were also, of course, some notable opponents to the Reformation, such as Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, who were executed for their opposition to it. And we see that there was an Elizabethan religious settlement to which the origins of Anglicanism are traditionally ascribed. The compromise was uneasy and was capable of veering between the extreme Calvinism on the one hand and Catholicism on the other hand, but compared to the bloody and chaotic state of affairs, it was successful under the Puritan Revolution or English Civil War in the 17th century. Now, Scotland also followed suit, and there was a tremendous person there who was instrumental in bringing Reformation to Scotland, and that person was John Knox. The Reformation Parliament of 1560, which repudiated the Pope's authority and forbade the celebration of the Mass and approved a Protestant confession of faith, was made possible by a revolution against French under the regime of Mary of Guise, who had governed Scotland in the name of her absent daughter, Mary Queen of Scots. The Scottish Reformation decisively shaped the Church of Scotland. and through it all other Presbyterian churches worldwide to Scottish Presbyterianism. This movement spread and greatly influenced the foundation or the formation of Puritanism among the Anglican Church in England. We know about the Scottish Covenanters who were persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this persecution by the Catholics drove some of the Protestant covenantal leadership out of Scotland and into France and later into Switzerland. Now, we also see that Protestantism also spread into France, where the Protestants were nicknamed Huguenots. And this touched off decades of warfare in France. And so there was a lot going on during this time period. There was wars and rumors of wars. There was chaos. There was major controversy between the Roman Church and the Reformed movement, the Protestant churches that were coming into the fore. And there was also a lot of bloodshed. For an example, atrocity and outrage became the defining characteristic of the time, including the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, when the Catholic Church annihilated between 30,000 and 100,000 Huguenots across France. And so it was. Now let's talk about the Netherlands briefly. The Reformation in the Netherlands, unlike many other countries, was not initiated by the rulers of the 17 provinces, but instead by multiple popular movements. We see that a lot of the people that were fleeing from these other countries where Rome still prevailed in civil government took refuge in the Netherlands. While the Anabaptist movement enjoyed popularity in the Netherlands in the early decades of the Reformation, Calvinism in the form of the Dutch Reformed Church became the dominant Protestant faith in the country. And we also see that the Protestant movement moved to Hungary during the 16th century. And they were subscribing to the teachings of Martin Luther and Calvin. So, to kind of wind this up or summarize, the Protestant churches and the Reformations throughout the countries had led to a series of religious wars which devastated much of Germany, killing between 25 and 40% of its population. And Protestantism became a relevant religion in Denmark, Sweden, France, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands. But many of those had been staunch defenders of the Catholic Church. And so we see God's sovereignty revealed in all of this. We see that God is sovereign over everything, including every event that took place during this time of history, and how that it brought about the truth of the sovereign grace of God Himself, not of works of righteousness that we have done, but through His own mercy and grace He saves us. And that was really the crux of what was being taught in the Protestant churches. You know, by grace we're saved, not of works, lest any man should boast. And we see also that during this time period that there was a great, great sense of Christology, the focus on Christ and His completed work and His mission at the cross. We also see that the focus was upon the Word of God, sola scriptura, not all of these things that were ushered in by the pagans, which was so prevalent in the Roman Catholic Church. There was also the emphasis against idolatry, graven images, and we've already talked about the Protestants' position against the selling of indulgences and doctrines of purgatory and praying to the dead and worshiping Mary and going through a pope or a priest when we know that Jesus Christ is our high priest. And so I think that it's good to look at the history of how this came into being, and it's an important part of history, not only church history, but history in general. And you know, we look at how Luther took a stand against and put his life on the line. In fact, his saying was, when he went to Rome, "Here I stand. Here I stand," after giving his answer to those who were laying charges against him for heresy. And now, today, we have the same, I believe, we're seeing what you want to call it, I would call it a counter-reformation. And the Reformation today is to come out of organized religion and go back to the New Testament church of worshiping in house churches. That's the counter-reformation. Forget all these huge ecclesiastical bodies dictating the local churches what they should or shouldn't do. Forget all these mega churches who have got into sensory religion. Forget all these religions that are taking on extra biblical positions. Forget the 501c3 churches. And so today the counter-reformation has come out from among her, and be ye separate, saith the Lord. Touch not the unclean. Those that are promoting the New World Order and Arminian doctrines of today running rampant. We know later on that as we looked at the whole scenario between the doctrines of Calvin and the doctrines of Arminius, that they were in conflict. But now the Arminian doctrines have pretty much taken hold upon most churches today in the United States, and the counter-reformation is for those who are in the so-called Reformed churches that now have gone into Pelagianism all over again. And they're taking on all kinds of new theological terms such as common grace and terms that are antithetical in their teachings. And most of the so-called Reformed churches of the day are very much Pelagius. And so if we are true to the Word of God, we're going to come out from among them, and we're going to have a counter-reformation, which is to come against those who call themselves Reformed but aren't Reformed at all. Now, we don't call ourselves Reformed. We put ourselves in the same lot as those Anabaptists who never went into Rome back there prior to the 15th century. And, most of those people back then were worshiping in house churches. And there were small groups of people that were standing strong for the Word of God. So, that's in a nutshell the history of the Protestant churches. Do you have any questions?
No, thank you.